Okay, we're going to get started here. People are lingering, coming in. Come on, Mara, walk faster. But don't stumble down the stairs. So I'm going to apologize in advance. We're supposed to be addressing mental health, and I've created some mental health issues. I've had several of my panelists who've been saying to me, you know, what am I supposed to be prepared to do? And I just don't like preparing. I don't want prepared statements on the panel. I like it to be spontaneous, and I realize that creates a certain amount of anxiety with my panelists. So I apologize in advance for that, but it's kind of on purpose. So in addition to that, sort of in the spirit of innovation here, I want to try something a little bit different. I think today has gone great, but rather than spending a lot of time where every one of our panelists tells us who they are, we want to take a little different approach. I want you to blend in who you are by answering a question. I want to go right into some discussion, so maybe we get some debate going on here. And the other thing I want to do a little different, I think it's a little different, is I want to flip this a little bit. So this session is supposed to be on education and workforce, and really for me, it's all three. I always say I work in education, mental health, and workforce as I think about it through neuroscience, and they interact in lots of interesting ways. And I want to flip it in the sense that we talk a lot more about that, you know, ground up about education and mental health, and the workforce often isn't the place you start. It's always the outcome. You know this, especially if you're a parent, as I am, of kids that have graduated from college. It's like you killed yourself to get them through the education system, and now the real game begins. They have to get a job and be, you know, gainfully employed in society. Harris is sitting here with a new baby about to be born, and he looks like a deer in headlights, realizing that that's what he's going to hit in another 22 years. So. And on top of that, I actually have a ringer today. I haven't told her she's that, but I've invited. We had somebody drop out. Jean couldn't join us today, so I've asked a colleague of mine, Jana, who does a number of things with me, and I've asked her, and she's kind of a ringer because she's actually a very popular TED Talk speaker, and she does a lot of speaking, in particular on the 21st century workforce, and ties it back to neuroscience and other things that we care about. So I'm actually going to ask her to start. I haven't told her this. I want her to start.
You only just asked me to be on the panel about half an hour ago.
Yeah, I did. I said, hey, are you interested? And what I'm going to ask you to do in addition to that is I'm going to ask you to take your speech that's probably like an hour long, and I want you to condense it in about 3 to 5 minutes, and just I want you to frame how you would frame workforce. And then what I want to do is we're going to go around, and I want to get everybody is going to have a different viewpoint with their different skill set, and we'll talk more about that. And I want to work our way into how the workforce implications impact how we think about education and mental health, rather than, I think a lot of times we do it the other way around. So I'm going to turn it over first to Jana. Go.
All right. And I always say, yeah, I can do that. I just talk faster to fit it in.
Just talk.
No.
Yeah. An hour and 5. This is like turning it up to 10x speed on your Kindle.
There you go.
Yeah.
So nice to be here, and I am a pediatrician by training. What I say often is by training, so that you know there's more to it. But what I started focusing on for purpose of how I got here and for the story I'm going to quick tell in 3 to 5 minutes is what really caught my attention based on what we've been talking about before is the need for cross-sector collaboration. In my case, I was looking at health and education, and the fact that all of a sudden I said I'm a child person, but all of a sudden I was an early childhood person, not just because I care about young children, but because I'm a root cause person. And then I said, well, great, now I'm not just a child person, I have to be a data person, because all of a sudden we couldn't share data across, in the US, the HIPAA and FERPA compliant barriers and things. So then I got into data, and then I started looking at all of the social determinants of health. Now we've gotten to the point where 80% of traditional health outcomes are determined by things outside of the traditional healthcare system. Thinking, well, now we need to get all the housing and transportation and food insecurity and things integrated in. And then, because that wasn't enough, I decided that if I was going to make the case for investing in early childhood, and in particular the early brain science or early brain and child development, especially for children born into poverty and facing adversity, I was going to need to do it in a way that wasn't just preaching to the choir. I was known in the parenting space, the pediatric space, education, social services, all of that, that was the choir. And I decided I would translate what I knew into business and policy language to get people to pay attention so that the sector that I was looking at, the early childhood space, would get more than what typically is scraps of funding that people chase after. So what I did was, here's the summary of what I thought. I thought, okay, if we're looking at life, life outcomes for children, and the question is, how do we get children off of a relatively dismal life trajectory, born into poverty, facing adversity? And I started with the question, what if despite all of our business savvy, data-driven, technology-informed know-how and all that the information age has put right at our fingertips, we're nevertheless raising our children to succeed in a world that no longer exists? And I did that, I always say it's a mouthful, but because I wanted to have a minute to take a step back and say, let's look to where children, the world children are gonna be living in, their voices, what they're experiencing. And if you distill it down to two things, globally complex, rapid change, and largely fueled by technology, like exponential change. I can say that to a room full of preschool teachers, and they will nod at me and they understand it, or to parents of young children, and they understand that, but to also rooms full of business leaders and policymakers. And so then I said, okay, if we look at in that world, what skills, because I decided everybody and their second cousin wanted to talk about skills. I do a lot of media translation communication work, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna frame this around skills, which now turns out very conveniently to be brain health, brain skills as the two focused areas. But if I say what skills become more valuable, knowing the right answer isn't as helpful when we've all got smartphones in our pocket, but asking good questions is really important for anyone who's ever played with ChatGPT. You ask a bad question, you get really bad answers. And the same thing is, what if the answer isn't known, and how do you handle failure and resilience and adaptability and all these other skills? So that's where I said, what skills are most valuable? Conveniently, the World Economic Forum came out with a list of skills right when I was asking that question. And 2/3 of them were all of these soft, non-cognitive, and other skills. So what I did, and what's actually not hard to do once you start looking at it, is say, if we've got communication, collaboration, teamwork, adaptability, resilience, grit, perseverance, emotional intelligence, the ability to fail and adapt as skills, I said, let me show you what those skills look like during the first 5 years, during their foundational development, lots of evidence to support it. And oh, by the way, cool brain science that's really, for early childhood, been around since the 90s. So in the early childhood space, we say, we have what we need to know to be able to move on this and to get people to pay attention. So I just distilled it down and linked it. And what I've found is that that's gotten to the level where I spend half my time talking to audiences about the future of work, global business leaders summits. The British Parliament, I don't know where no one's, but called me to talk to their early childhood group, trying to say, how do we link? We're hearing this. We hear we should invest. We heard upstream several times on the panels this morning. I was looking at how do we tie that upstream, and what it does is it's not just early childhood, it carries through all of the educational years up into higher education workforce. But the brain science really has worked to tie that all together. And of course, as we've heard, and as I think everyone in the room believes, it's not just the straight neuroscience, it's all of these aspects, whether it's learning and cognition. The question I always ask, is that health or is that education when we talk about the brain? And the answer is it's both, but we got really good at siloing it and parsing it out artificially, and now we're all trying to race to put it back together again. Is that good for an overview, Steve?
I think that was a pretty good job to get us going here, huh? Thank you. Okay, I want to flip it the other way toward Dr. Marilu Gorno-Tempini, who is both a doctor, a clinical researcher, which means she has a PhD and she's a medical doctor, which turns out at UCSF, there's piles of them. It's like when you hang around there, you think getting a PhD is not a big deal. My kid's starting to think about it now. It's like, oh my God, it's a big deal. Anyway, and Marilu's a big deal because she's one of the leading researchers in the world on the neurobiology of language. So Marilu, I want to tell us what Laura just said. Now you're dealing in the world of neuroscience, and especially in the context of Dyslexia Center, younger children. How do you think about it? And I think especially about the social emotional brain, which we still know in a sense the least about, or I think of it as the place where there's the most opportunity to translate it to the real world. But how do you think about it?
Yes, thank you, Steve. You know, this is one of my favorite topics. A few of you have
Is that on?
Not working? Is it on?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, good. A little closer.
Have heard me talk about this in the last in the last couple of days, but we have divided behavioral health and cognitive health for a couple of centuries now. We talk about neurology, we talk about behavioral health and psychiatry, but really that's an old way to look at things, because now that we know that most behavioral symptoms come from the brain, it's the same brain that sustains cognition. So the same brain network that sustains executive functioning, what we think of a very cognitive function, logic, reasoning, are the same brain networks that, if not functioning optimally, can create behavioral issues, bad decision making, impulsivity, emotional dysregulation. There is a lot of overlap. So I think our next stage, and is what we're doing at UCSF, where we have a Weil Institute for the Neurosciences now that includes both neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, and behavioral sciences. The next generation is really putting these things together and realizing that a lot of the children that have that quote unquote misbehave or have behavioral challenges in school might actually do so because they have cognitive challenges. They have difficulties with executive functioning. They might have difficulties with language. They might not understand exactly what the teacher is saying, and so do something different. And in the same way, when a child is anxious or depressed, their brain is not ready to learn the more academic skills. So these two things really need to go together. And as a neurologist who I'm a behavioral neurologist, which means I'm really at the edge between psychiatry and neurology. What we look at is older patients or children who have brain lesions for some known reason. So a little stroke or a little tumor or a trauma. And then we look at their cognitive and behavioral symptoms. And we see that often they overlap. The same brain region, the same network causes both difficulties in cognition and in behavior, and the two need to be addressed together. And the same way we want to look at, more in developmental issues, we want to look at strengths and weaknesses. So many times when there is the asymmetric brains are the ones that give rise to new ideas, innovations, even genius. So when we see a behavioral health weakness, there might be a cognitive strength that we need to highlight and might help those kids feel more capable and feel also empowered to address their behavioral issues. So we really should try, I think, in our future, and we were talking at lunch that our systems in schools are not organized that way, because there is learning differences and then there is behavioral health challenges. But I think a challenge for us for the future, or even in the system that we are in now, is how do we integrate with two things, because they're the output of the same brain and we need to address them together.
Excellent. Thank you, Marilu. So let's flip it. I want to flip this over now to Melissa Stafford Jones. She has this little $5 billion project she's working on. And I know you're not in the education system. You're in HHS. You report to Secretary Ghali, but you're thinking about the whole system, and there was a paper just written about it that you were deeply involved with. How good of a job are we doing integrating this new neuroscience and the 21st century workforce into the thinking about the system, which I know is the system's a hard thing to move around, right?
Thanks, Steve, and it's an honor to be on the panel. Appreciate all the discussions yesterday and today. You heard a little bit earlier today from my colleague Autumn Boylan from our California Department of Healthcare Services about Governor Newsom's master plan for kids' mental health and the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative. And the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative really is intended to be an opportunity for transformation. And I think we're aiming for it to be transformational through a few specific approaches. One is to deeply focus on centering youth, what youth want and need, their strengths, what they tell us contributes to their mental health and well-being. How do we actually embed that in the systems work that we are doing? The second is to really think about collaboration and integration across systems. We know our systems are siloed today, both, as you just heard from Marilu, in terms of education and health, but even beyond, child welfare, juvenile justice systems. We have a lot of silos. And what we hear from youth and families is those silos get in the way of them getting the care and supports that they need. So how do we really start to break down those silos? And that was one of the papers that's on our website. We call it the Ecosystem Working Paper. It's really a working paper to say, how would you take that vision and put it into practice on the ground in the field? What would look different about the work we all do together across our systems? And so we identified 10 conditions for systems change to support that collaboration, integration. And we're in the process now of launching a demonstration project that will actually put that into practice in a series of communities across California that said, if you really want to implement, currently in California, we are implementing simultaneously with the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, also a $4 billion initiative to implement the community schools framework in our K-12 education setting. Rather than saying, well, over here we're going to implement community schools and over here we're going to implement the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, what if you actually saw them as joint? Two sides of a coin that go together. What would that look like for all the relevant partners to come together, actually work together to implement both of those initiatives? And so we're going to be doing that in a small number of communities across the state, and then pulling up the lessons learned from that to turn it into a roadmap that could support any community in California really working on that kind of coordinated joint implementation. And then the third focus of transformation is really meeting kids where they are. And so when you look at all those, being youth-centered, working on collaboration and integration across systems, and really creating an ecosystem that supports behavioral health and well-being for our children and youth, and meeting kids where they are, that makes it essential that we focus on that school health collaboration. And I think Marilu and I were talking at lunch, and I think it is a challenge. I think that our current systems, and I'm guessing this is not limited to California, but our current systems in California do have a set of lanes and opportunities when we say something is a behavioral health issue. These are our opportunities to provide service, support, to fund. And when it's considered a learning issue, there's a different set of lanes. And so I think the opportunity we have right now with this effort in the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, and in partnership with our community schools framework efforts, is to really start to bridge that gap at the systems level. I still think we'll have even more work to do after that, because we're working around that separation, I would say, right now.
Yeah.
I guess the question will be, is there some future iteration where we can actually bring a deeper integration? But for now, we're really focused on getting those systems to work together, and not just doing it at a theoretical level, but really trying to put it into practice. I'll just share one small example. There's 20 components to the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative. One of them is a program that provides financial incentives for Medicaid managed care plans to partner with schools. And what we've heard from the partners is that in most places around the state, those relationships have not historically existed. So the payer of health services had no relationship with the school, and yet they're serving the same kids and the same challenges those kids face. But what we've heard from the partners is, although they are very excited about some of the joint efforts they're doing today, because they are implementing some joint strategies as we speak, what they're really excited about is, they said, we've built this pipeline of a relationship that we can keep investing in and keep working together. The power has been in the collaborative infrastructure built in addition to the specific activities right now. And I think we're trying to do that through CYBHI at a very large scale systems level.
And on a positive note, because if you get stuck in the system problems, it gets frustrating. But on a positive note, I started this work, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, and I used to hear a couple of things. One is people would say, the schools are never, this neuroscience, the schools are never going to want this stuff. And that's not true today. We've had tremendous uptake. Teachers really care about neuroscience, and they really would like to integrate it more in the school side. And the other thing is that, again, 15 years ago, people used to say, the one entity that's never considered in education is the customer, which in this case is the student. We care about teachers and facilities and unions and buildings and administration and retirement, all these other things, but we were not very student-centered. And I think today there's a lot of language around youth voice and being much more student-centered. So that makes me more encouraged that we're moving in the right direction. So the thing I love about this brain capital convening is that we have so many people from so many different backgrounds. I want to flip this now over to Patrick Brennan, who's going to bring in the policy side of this. What does this mean for you? You've worked at a federal level. You've worked in a senator's office. You've worked in the state of California. We've worked together on sponsoring some major legislation. What do you do with all this? What does the future look like for you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve, and it's an honor to be on this panel. My motto in college was a professor can't fail a friend, and so now I've got lots of friends who are professors. I think I've been struck by the discussion of needing to take the discussions happening here into the policy-making space. And yesterday at the end of the meeting, there was a call to use some of the tools of policy-making to begin to drive that change. I think if I could highlight two tools of policymaking that people could go home and think about, one would be all politics are personal. Elected officials are elected officials. They gotta convince the people in their legislative district to vote for them so they can go back and drive change at a national level. And so I think whatever we're doing, we have to contextualize in the local model. So I think one of the reasons we've had success in California is because of the personal nature of this issue to Governor Newsom. He himself is dyslexic. He cares deeply about it. If you talk to him, he'll describe finding parent-teacher conference slips in his mother's things and the teacher saying that he couldn't hold a pencil properly. Well, now he's holding that same pencil to sign bills that are changing, literally, the course of our country. And I think that just sort of talks about the personal nature of politics and how personal can be used to drive the power of policy. I think along those lines, we've got to think about incentive alignment too. We've got to make sure that the things we're doing are incentivized at the legislative level to be able to bring those two together. You know, we're trying to do this at UCLA and the California Institute, which is a partnership between UC Law San Francisco and UCSF. We're building a fellowship program that will launch in 2024. It's going to include policymakers. It's going to include faculty members. It's going to include educators. It's going to include mental health workers. And we're going to bring all of these people together, and they're going to take on a problem of practice in a cohort setting. And at the end, they're going to either publish on that, or they're going to propose legislation, or they're going to do something. And so our hope is that we can use this to demonstrate the personal nature of policy and align incentives. You know, a policymaker will get to learn from a researcher and distinguished faculty member like Dr. Gorno-Tempini. An educator will be able to say to a policymaker like Toby Ewing, this is what I'm experiencing in the classroom when this requirement for community schools is coming down the line. I think the thing I'd end with, Steve, is a call to conversation. We've got to be in conversation, and we've got to speak in a similar language so that we're not talking across each other. And so I think, just to kind of sum it up, one, it's a call to conversation that aligns incentives and makes it personal so that the ultimate change can happen globally.
Thank you, Patrick. Very interesting. The one person I don't know on this panel is Alan Boldon, and we've only got to briefly to chat, and I'm gonna say, and I pardon the pun, I'm gonna ask him to explain to us how he weaves this thinking together with his activities, because he has an organization called Weave, or Weave something. So tell us how you weave through these conversations.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so tell us why you're here, because it seems a bit of a puzzle at the moment. I suppose I'm trying to weave bits of the conversation I've heard today, and I think what we're looking for is systemic change. Very early on in my working life, going back to the 80s, 90s, the government of Luxembourg, with Health and Social Care Services of Luxembourg, created a job for me. That's a longer story, so I won't go into that. But effectively, I was asked to create kind of strategic interventions into every kind of social and healthcare institution you can think of. And really, I was asked to look at social and economic challenges, and I added an environmental agenda. And so it was really trying to look at holistic approaches to complex challenges. And some of the things that we developed projects, training programs. I got involved in leadership development. I developed what we called a Changemaker program, so I ran a Changemaker intensive. And that was a 2-week program, and I'll just mention that briefly. We were looking at who were the potential agents of change and who were the potential people who were frustrating change. in all of these social and healthcare institutions, and even in government, and we dropped them into this program. And what we were doing in that program was a form of place-based learning or problem-based learning. Haven't heard that much talked about today, but it is an approach to pedagogy which I've since committed a lot of time to. So I'll say again briefly what it is. Instead of working in the silos of disciplines, basically, you know, look at the Finnish education system, tops the world rankings every year more or less, and they're dedicated to problem-based learning. So what you do is you ask a group of people to take on a problem. It might be building a bridge, it might be looking at soil health. And in doing so, they do have to reach for disciplinary specialisms. They have to kind of say, oh, we need to know more about this, we need to know more about this. But effectively what you're trying to do is combine very different ways of knowing, bring different specialisms together and develop hybrid or transdisciplinary approaches to complex challenges. Primary school kids can do this. It's exactly the place where we should start, and it can run all the way through education. I used to invite people into this program from higher education, and they said, we're going further in 2 weeks than we do in a whole academic year. And I thought, well, that's terrible. So I did get involved in academia, and I've got a strange habit of designing degrees. I've designed about 15 master's and PhD programs and advised universities around the world because these models work. They're much more powerful pedagogically. There's a democratization of learning. You have experts, but they only have one part of the puzzle in trying to understand a complex issue. You know, you might be looking at a social issue to start with, but very quickly you realize that it's absolutely connected to economics, it's connected to environmental conditions. We've heard a lot about that today. So you get very rapidly, in a very practical way, into solving problems, but also in reimagining learning. I was a bit involved in a program in the UK called Building Schools for the Future, it was called. And the schools were all bidding for money, and they wanted new sports facilities, a new science lab, or whatever. And the schools I worked with, I said, well, you know, in your town you've got, or in your city, you've got incredible sporting facilities. You've got great libraries and museums and other facilities. What you should be looking at is how you can connect up. And it won't just be that you get access to those facilities and you can spend the money that you're going to bid for on other things, but your institution will become more porous. You'll be working much more collaboratively, and whether it's your primary school kids or your secondary school kids or your university students, they'll be working with the professionals, the institutions, the bodies that might become their employer. And it will feel much more like a joined-up community, a joined-up society. It's a powerful model. So we do know quite a lot about how to do this. So my latest projects, I was running a big charity until fairly recently. I've committed this company, Weave. So what we're doing is we're establishing learning labs, initially a sort of European learning cluster, so a learning lab in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Luxembourg. And effectively what we're doing is running a portfolio of programs. We have what we call an imagination residency, which brings remarkable people together. And we ask them to try and inhabit each other's ways of knowing, and then to try and imagine new forms of collaboration and how we can engage with complex challenges. That then goes into a leadership program. We're calling it a bioregional leadership program. And we're bringing leaders from education, from business, from civic bodies, from activist groups, faith groups, community organizations, and basically kind of saying, how can you work together to look after the place you're in? You're all part of, you know, what can be a remarkable solution. You might know a few of the people in the room, but you probably don't know everybody. And actually, if you can work together beautifully, it will benefit all of you. The sort of mutual benefit is remarkable, and we need to really look at that. And then we move into a change maker program, and the people who join the program as participants become the leaders. It's a kind of train the trainer program. We're doing that in multiple sites because we want places to learn from and with each other, to develop, you know, kind of adaptive solutions to different bioregional challenges. We're looking at seeding. We've been invited to seed labs in various places, Singapore, Lithuania, the US, Armenia, Colombia. So we hope eventually to sort of establish bioregional learning labs in most parts of the world to look at how we can rethink learning in connection with business, with civic bodies. Final statement. Go back, I feel like I've heard so many things that I heard a long time ago, and I do worry that we just cycle around these things. But back in 1990, I think, I was asked to look at a text from the World Health Organization, and it was said, we need to shift, we've shifted from health education to health promotion to health promoting places. And I thought that was such a powerful idea. What might a health promoting place be? Some people took it into how you design a hospital and kind of design a place for well-being. and embed it in a city, connect it to a city. It probably has all sorts of, literally physically designed features that promote health and well-being. And it will be connected up with all sorts of other bodies so that it's not an isolated place where you go when you get sick. So we hive off these problems rather than connecting them up. We need to revisit quite a lot of great ideas that we already have. There we are. Bit of weaving, hopefully.
There we are. Simple concept. What a great way to model thinking about the future. And I know that one of our sponsors here, HKS, that got us this facility and is very involved in, and I think you're on several panels where we're talking about the importance of neuroscience and place, which is even more interesting when you think about we've kind of moved into this world where now we're working more remotely. So what does place even matter? And I know we've got Upali here and some others that are leading the thinking about that, which intersects nicely with that. It weaves in wonderfully, Alan. Thank you.
I'm pleased you're adopting it, Steve. Thanks.
So the youngest person by far, certainly from my perspective here, is Erin Smith. So Erin is really interesting because she's sort of closest to the having lived experience with everything we're talking about here. She's just finishing up at Stanford. She's already done a startup, which would seem like a big deal, except she's in Palo Alto and everybody has a startup there. But she also is a fellow with the Global Brain Health Institute, which is connected to UCSF. And again, I think most of the fellows are at least twice your age, if not more. So you come at this, you're kind of our child genius here. And you've got this neuroscience background, and you've just really finishing up a big part of your education. When you hear this, what do you think about? Where does your brain go?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm so excited and honored to be on this panel and speaking with you all today. So I think as I've been listening to everyone's thoughts and reflections on education and workforce and how this intersects with these very important brain and mental health questions and with brain capital that we're contemplating these questions today, I think I've been thinking back in my mind about the different stages of my own educational pathway. So for a bit of context, I grew up in the Midwest in Kansas, attended very like normal public elementary school, middle school, high schools. But one thing that my high school had was a biotechnology program. And so this was a really large catalyst for me to start being involved in research, to start with the example of problem-based learning, to really be able to start with this problem-based hands-on learning. And for me, I think the best education that occurred was within the lab. So having access to a lab when I was very young and being able to work on different research projects ranging from environmental engineering to cancer biology to ultimately computational neuroscience, which led me into the work that I'm doing today. And also during my time in high school, I was running a nonprofit that was focused on teaching elementary and middle school girls across the Midwest how to code and how to use computer science. But I think what was really key, I learned very quickly during this program that the key was to frame it from a problem-based learning perspective, specifically around, and this is kind of a full circle moment with where we are today, but specifically around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So if you try to teach somebody how to code in the abstract, how to have a computer move a dot to another location, people, especially youth, lose interest very quickly. But instead, if you reframe that and you're teaching them the same skills, the same coding techniques, but you're doing it in a way where they can address hunger in their community, where they can make healthcare more accessible, that's when the light switches start to go off. And so I think that oftentimes when I'm thinking about education, I go back to those experiences of teaching different people how to code, and then kind of fast forwarding a little bit as part of my more recent educational experiences, did this program called the Teal Fellowship, which is traditionally for people who are dropping out of university to do startups. And so really through that program and through the different friends and colleagues that I have through that who are really questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying college and university. And then after I returned to Stanford and finishing up my undergrad, that's been an entirely new perspective on education and workforce challenges. Going back to the nonprofit that I was running, I think there's a lot of room for college majors to be redesigned, to equip people, as Laura was saying, with the skill sets that will be most valuable for tomorrow. I think there's been amazing reports that have come out from the World Economic Forum, from these other global leadership, global organizations, but actually being actionized and translated into the classroom setting and into universities, there's a huge disconnect. And so I think even potentially, could you redesign college majors to be focused on a UN Sustainable Development Goal, where you're focused on that problem, and then you're learning fundamental skill sets like AI, like coding, like economics, like policy. And so I think these are the questions that we need more conversation around. And then very quickly, the last thing that came to mind is thinking about my experience at UCSF at the Global Brain Health Institute. And so this program, it brings together people from all around the world, and it's a mixture of clinicians, artists, ethicists, technologists, policymakers, all focused on reducing the scale and impact of dementia worldwide. And this sort of multidisciplinary learning, it fosters so much creativity that I think I hadn't found it in any of my other classes at Stanford, at these other organizations. And so I think as we're thinking about the global brain and mental health crisis, this very large, seemingly intractable global challenge, and the many different factors that have been highlighted in prior panels and prior keynotes this morning, I would really challenge us to think about how education and how workforce can be reimagined, can be redesigned, and can not only produce really amazing papers and frameworks, but how we can actionize those frameworks. So I'll close there, but thank you for the question.
How about that? It's interesting, in the world of kids who have learning differences, what we know is that they are much better at project-based learning. They're just not interested in conceptual learning. And you see that, by the way, and you also see that in the high school, the career technical education programs. The kids that couldn't add or subtract, all of a sudden they learn to become landscape architects, where they're forced to have to measure plots of land, and they figure it out. They Google it and they teach themselves, because now they have a reason. So we see a lot of that. In a lot of ways, that's a better way to learn, and it's a better way to teach. But our school systems are often stuck in, they're a 21st century organization stuck in the 19th century. So it's a challenge. Okay, Toby Ewing. Toby is executive director of the California Mental Health Commission, focused on mental health. You're kind of stuck in the middle of all this between the workforce and the education, but you're used to being stuck in the middle because you work in California politics, right? So tell us what this means. How do you think about mental health across the lifespan and from education to workforce? What's your framework?
Thanks, Steve, and I appreciate the chance to be here, and I regret that I sat in the chair in the middle now that I'm thinking about it. For the last 20 years or so in California, through the Mental Health Commission, we've really been trying to reframe the conversation from this very deficit-based conversation around mental illness and how we are forced, because of economic constraints, to ration access to care and really be reactive, right? Traditionally, conversations around mental health have really only included providers, family members, and clients. And California decided some years ago, about 20 years ago, that we really have to change the conversation and rebrand away from illness response towards well-being. And so the question around the lifespan gets really exciting when we think expansively about what is the opportunity, particularly if we reframe mental health as less than a clinical intervention or a clinical opportunity, and think really broadly. And in California, our policy frames mental health in the context of succeeding in school and succeeding in work and avoiding bad things like our child welfare programs or our criminal justice programs, and avoiding suicide and suffering. It really tries to define mental health in the context that's very consistent with UN goals for well-being, right? If we take the negative things that we're often reacting to and turn them into the positive things about keeping families together, around happiness, around productivity, economic opportunity, stable and secure housing, safety and security, social connectedness. That's how we've been really trying to think about mental health. What I really like about the brain capital concept is it expands that even more, particularly, and to connect this to the conversation around workforce and education, particularly around the roles of young people. Part of the challenge we have is the difficulties, particularly in the public sector, of thinking expansively about who has agency, who has the capacity to participate in decision making, and you know, consistent with the conversation here around project-based learning or place-based thinking. Marilu, I love your comment about oftentimes when we see a behavioral health challenge, there may be some other aspect of that person's brain, of that person's life that just shows profound significance and expertise, right? With brain capital, particularly around young people, which is where I'm really excited, is this idea of activating young people to actually define what the opportunity is, right? What we find is so often the mismatch between services and needs is really because of the difficulties we have in our ability to listen and the ability to engage, and consistent with the comments about you know, simple math is hard to engage unless you give someone a task. Same thing, if we can actually empower young people, right, not just young people, but let's recognize that that might be where the greatest return on investment is. If we can really think differently about brain capital through the lens of young people in the context of well-being, and since we're here at a UN-themed event, consistent with Sustainable Development Goals that are really focused not just on the economics, but on this notion of well-being, I think we can engineer or generate or catalyze a whole series of new investment opportunities, a whole new series of ways of thinking about how we do care delivery, but also, often more importantly, how we even talk about what the goal is in ways that can address stigma, in ways that can create new pathways to engaging young people to enter the space, to address some of our workforce needs, in ways that can help us better understand how the pathways and the patterns, the programs, the policies, how we fund healthcare, employment, education, housing, all of these other challenges that we in the United States are struggling with, we can begin to invest in these new approaches that will allow us to get past some of these historic bottlenecks, right, that today really force us to think about how we put more money into a system instead of thinking about how do we change the incentives and the paths and the opportunities, particularly if young people own those strategies. They're much more likely to engage and be responsive, right? You know, thinking about social media and AI, which has been on our minds for a long time, these conversations about how government can regulate, we really need to, that's important, but we also really need to think about how do we equip young people to regulate those industries themselves. They're the target of those industries, and if we can turn that power balance around so that young people, the audience, is actually driving the conversations, the technology, the marketplace, I think that's how we're going to get past some of the challenges that we have in front of us.
That's great. You know, as someone who invests in technologies, you know, the technologies are just tools. You can work both ways. I can only imagine when, you know, people started driving Ford cars down the road in, you know, 1909, you know, and these people were sitting on their horses saying, you know, those people are going to hell, but this is a just horrible technology. So, you know, it can cut both ways. So, bring it home for us, Laura. What did you hear? How are we doing? Are we working toward being prepared for the 21st century? Where are we making it? Where are we not? What do you think?
So first of all, what I heard, which is one of the themes that I really like to focus on, is that everyone gets to pick their definition of success. So when I talked about 21st century skills for success, which catches lots of people's attention if you frame it that way, whether it's success in school, I always say there's the school workforce trajectory, there's health outcomes, there's well-being and happiness and countering loneliness and things. So I think we're doing well in pulling pieces together where we all see that. And I think everyone's coming to the conclusion, this cross-sector, whether it's intersecting, I was having conversations at lunch about intersecting data platforms, because this is where I said I'm not a data person, but now I have to be, because then we can start to show outcomes, we can redirect money. One of the things that struck me early on is I came at this thinking there's so little money invested in young, poor children, and then realized there's a whole bunch of little pots of money all over the place, but people don't even know that they all share the same goal. And I still kind of have that feeling that, yes, we need some more resources for what we're talking about, this big brain capital effort, but that there's also the pooling of even just the expertise in the room and the resources and the commitment. If people can see how what I'm doing connects to what someone else is doing, that may seem completely opposite. So I think we're getting there. And the last thing I'll say, which is good for purposes of this group, is I think that using brain science is a very, I want to say, neutral, non-polarizing, and very convincing way to get people interested. In fact, even my publisher made me put the title, use the word brain in one of the books I wrote, because, I said, well, I don't know that we quite want to convey it this way. He goes, doesn't matter, brain cells. Right? So I've always hear that in my head, which is if you can get people interested in the brain science, you can do it as cocktail conversations for someone who has no interest in neuroscience per se. It's a little harder to argue with when you've got both the evidence base and it's neuroscience. And you can go broad, as we also heard here, which is, the mental health, we've got the deficit and the disorder side, we've got the positive well-being side, which I think is a big push, and everything in between. So I think we're getting there. I think these are good pieces to have pulling together.
Are there such things as red and blue brain cells? I don't know. Hopefully not. Anybody else want to jump in? Anything else you're compelled to say?
I just wanted, as I was listening, I was thinking about some of the specific things we've actually heard from youth in the work of the Children Youth Behavioral Health Initiative that speak to some of this. One, for example, is youth have been very clear with us that from their perspective, culture is healing. And they've asked us to think about what are the ways in which their culture, their identity, their family, their community can be supported and activated as part of supporting their healing and their well-being, particularly those who've experienced significant trauma, maybe individually, but also in terms of their communities historically. So you can imagine we've heard this specifically from our Native American youth, but from many other youth as well. Another thing youth have been very clear about, because we have done many, many engagement sessions with youth over the last few years, is that they see access to parks and green space and the outdoors and nature as critical to their mental health and well-being. And I think in the healthcare realm, we don't often, think about, well, how are we going to deliver outdoors? Right? But youth have told us this is what we want and need. So we've been, to the point about collaboration, talking with our colleagues in natural resources and parks about work they are doing to increase equitable access to parks. In the state of California, the governor has an initiative for greening blacktop space in schools, right? So how is it that we actually start to weave together these different things that youth are telling us they want and need that maybe no one initiative can do in its entirety? And we're trying to use the CYBHI as a catalyst for some of those other conversations. And then the last example I'll share is youth are clear when they have mental disorders and have clinical mental health needs, they want to see a mental health clinician. Right now there are barriers, it can take too long, it's too challenging. When they need clinical services, they want clinical supports. But youth emphasize even more what they really want is a behavioral health workforce that looks like them, speaks their language, comes from their community, and understands their life experience, and that is not necessarily a clinician. A group of youth that Autumn Boylan and I spoke with early on in the work of the initiative basically said, when we come to a school wellness center, the first person we want to see is not a clinician. We want to see this other kind of person. And actually, we are developing a whole new role in the behavioral health workforce continuum in California called a wellness coach. That is a non-licensed but certificated position that will really be that sort of near-peer model to address what youth are telling us they want and need out of the workforce. So I think many of the things we're talking about today are working to, and I think align with what we are hearing from youth. We just have to act on that and really move that forward throughout the system.
Yeah, yeah, really powerful. Alan, you had something to add?
Well, I'm very pleased that people are using Weave a lot. Our company motto, by the way, is nurturing systemic wisdom, which I think is another kind of framing for what the Brain Capital Project's trying to do. I suppose I just wanted to say something about resources. So, I talked about connecting up different kinds of agencies, bodies, organizations, and, certainly, I mean, I can give plenty of evidence for this. When you pool resources, you save money. So it's not about throwing money at problems all the time. Sometimes if it's about saying, well, we'll use your building, we'll use your staff, excuse me, we'll use, some of your research funding, whatever, pooling resources to look at, co-delivery, co-design can be really resource efficient. And just the other thing, maybe not. I need some water first. I'll come back.
Come back. So, yeah, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Marilu. Yeah.
Just one last thought that I wanted to bring in thinking about brain health and mental health and brain capital is really to think about that as we learn more from the neurosciences, we're moving towards a prevention model. So really think about identifying strengths and weaknesses early on in children in education, and I think that will also influence their success in the workforce. But that's something that is really new in neurology and psychiatry in the last 20 years. I mean, we've all seen what's happening even with Alzheimer's disease. We're going to treat Alzheimer's disease before it occurs, basically. And I think that's, again, where the brain sciences are going. So really important to think about prevention and early identification of strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you for saying that. I was saying earlier on to somebody that what gives me hope is the neuroscience, because the brain it's reversible biology, not in all cases, but in many cases. And that reversible biology with prevention and early intervention can lead to dramatically different outcomes than we have today. If I didn't have that, I think I would have given up. But that's what really pushes me. Alan, did you have a last thought there?
Well, yes, I mean, based on neuroscience, I think, one way of framing what we can do in learning is we can help learners to move between using rationality, logic, imagination, intuition. Problem-based learning is a great way to do that. And I do think it's an empowering form. And as a working class kid who found his way back into higher education, I don't want to put all the problems on young people, but people want to feel that their learning is purposeful. And one of the strategies I've used, and it does deliver a democratization of learning, is I've worked with world-leading experts who've got to the point where they're pushing at the edges of their thinking and practice, and they're willing to say that they don't know what comes next or what the answer is. And I've dropped them into all sorts of situations. I've done placemaking for cities and towns and governments. And the traffic modeling people will be very defensive, as will the economic development people. And they've got their ways of working. If you bring in a world expert and say, well, I don't know the solution to that, it liberates people. And they kind of say, okay, if you say that, well, maybe I can say that. But I do have something to offer. Yes, you do. How do we combine it? If you do that in learning for young people who want to feel purposeful, they don't want the burden of the world on their shoulders to deliver the solutions, but they know they have a key part. And if you bring those kinds of people together and say, well, let's co-design some learning programs that can deliver purposeful, meaningful solutions to some of the big challenges that we're facing, and we all feel those burdens.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Steve, can I add one more thing? I think just picking up on the cost associated with this, and the cost has been sort of mentioned a couple of times. And my sense is it's mentioned that can be an inducement for governments to take action. And I think one thing I'd encourage this group to do is familiarize yourself with how governments think about costs, particularly the Congressional Budget Office, the Department of Finance in California. So I think if we can begin to put the cost savings in the context and the models they use, then that's how you can begin to shape systems reform. Because if we can serve this thing up as a revenue reducer, a revenue creator, and a deficit reducer, that's easy money, as they say. And then second thing, I think just to the point of about all politics being personal, I've got a book that I will encourage you to read. It's called Home Style by Richard Fenno, great political scientist from upstate New York, where Chancellor Fegman is from. And that will give you a sense of sort of the metrics that legislators use to make decisions. So go out, order that book. I've got no financial interest in this, and email me, and let's talk about it.
Go ahead.
I-
Real last
Yeah,
answer.
and it's just a kind of tie-up framing that I've found really works based on the conversations we've been having is sort of, and you've heard me say this many times, but I started with a health 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 model. And again, very broad brush strokes. It's the first half of last century was the acute illness. Second half of last century was the chronic disease. And as the healthcare system had to shift, we had to expand the 4 traditional walls of the healthcare system to accommodate insurance. Everything had to adjust as we got to managing long-term chronic diseases. We are now well into wellness and prevention as Health 3.0. And instead of just expanding the 4 traditional walls of the healthcare system, I see it as this big amorphous blob outside of, and we're having to figure out how to get data in and out of the system. We're having to think differently in terms of strengths-based and wellness model. The same can be true, said, of the education system, where we've gone from 1.0 was just the schoolhouse, right, like the traditional, and then we've expanded it a bit. But if you look at where we're at now with Education 3.0, we are well outside the 4 traditional walls of the education system. We've got badging and certification, and do we even need degrees? We're heading towards a future where we've got books written called Work Without Jobs. It's all project-based and problem-based learning, and what I like to say is, in healthcare, we went from healthcare to health, one word difference, really big difference in terms of what we're talking about. In education, we've gone from education to learning, and learning doesn't happen in certain hours of the day in certain buildings. It's much more expansive. So that framework has seemed to work really well to get lots of people involved who might not otherwise be in those sort of traditional frames that we've been talking about in the past.
Awesome. What a rich conversation. Let's thank the panel. Thank you very much.